This is Professor L.B. Gaikwad's English Literature Web. I am Professor L.B. Gaikwad. Requests you first to like, share, comment and subscribe my YouTube channel. Here we have come in front of each other by taking the part 3 regarding the growth of poetry in the 16th century. The growth of poetry in the 16th century. Edmund Spenser's Amoretti in 1595 came and it promoted the sonnet writing. Remember, Edmund Spenser was the famous or popular poet in those days, and he brought his literary piece, and that is the Amoretti. And this piece became the guide to the poets, and therefore the sonnet writing came before, and many poets wrote their sonnets by following the Amoretti of Edmund Spenser. A mythological, erotic trend came, and this trend brought the theme of erotic matters. Now, what is the erotic matters? Erotic matters are the particular matters or the themes which are based on the sexual relationship of the men and women. And the poets took the symbolical figures as the mythological figures. They took the mythological figures in their poetry, and as the symbols, they put before the society the men and women who are present in the society. In those days, the relations of man and woman were very bad. Means the person means the persons were very bad, and they were falling in love with the women. And actually, the women were not giving them responses in the sense of love. But actually, some persons were being successful in loving women, and some persons were being unsuccessful, and that was the tragedy in the lives of the persons, and that's why the poets brought the theme of the erotic relations, sexual relations between the man and the woman. But these sexual relations were not the proper relations. Means they were the wrong relations. Means they were not the proper sexual relationship. Means that relationship was rather unlawful relationship, and that was the beautiful subject of the discussion, and that's why the poets of the 16th century brought this theme also. And for that explanation or for the description of the poems, they brought the mythological figures, and those mythological figures also were with the wrong relationships with each other, and those symbols show here the relations of the men and women in the society. These mythological poets use the mythological conceits. Remember, these poets brought these mythological poems, but they brought the mythological poems with the genre of the conceit. And what is this conceit? The conceit is the ingenious or fanciful comparison or the metaphor. And the metaphor and the fanciful comparison and the ingenious matter is very difficult for understanding in the sense of the readers, and that's why these mythological figures also were very difficult for the readers, and the readers were not understanding them properly. It means that the readers were very unable to know about these mythological figures, because actually people are very raw. Raw means they are very immature in the mythological figures, because they had or have no information about the relationship of the mythological figures, and such mythological figures were brought by these poets into their poetry, and that was really the very difficult thing on the part of the readers, and that's why the readers were very much unable to understand this poetry, and that's why this poetry again became very much difficult for the readers. The examples of the mythological poetry are: the first is Christopher Marlowe's Hero and Leander in 1598. Second is Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis in 1593. And third is Chapman Ovid's Banquet of Sin in 1595. These are the these are the three examples which are really the popular examples of the mythological poems. The poets turn then to the social satire and the religious verse. Remember, here again I will say that the poets in the 16th century turned to the social satire. Social satire means they went into the social criticism, means they criticized the society socially, means they brought some issues from the society, and some bad customs from the society, some bad I will say traditions from the society, and they criticize, they attack such social satires. These traditions and these customs with the help of the social satires, and that's why this thing also became very much difficult for the readers. Again, they brought the religious verse. Verse means, I will say, the poems, means the genre was religious, or they wrote their poetry in the religiousness, and again this religiousness was very difficult for the common man, and the common man could not understand really this poem, and that's why this poem, again I will say that, did not reach to the height of the progression. This satire was read by the middle class steadily but interestingly. Remember, the important thing is that this social satire was read by the middle class people, but the middle class people read these satires steadily, means they did not read the social satire easily. They also took some time to read the social satire, but they were taking interest. But how they were taking interest? They were taking the interest with some gaps, means they took many days to understand such poems, and that's why this was also very difficult for the readers. Joseph Hall was the first satirist of this trend. Means, remember, this trend was brought by Joseph Hall, and this Joseph Hall was the first satirist of this trend, or of this poetry. Then the poets adopted the chronicle history, which was lengthy. Remember, these poets brought the poems now on the theme of the chronicle history. Chronicle history means it was the chronological history, it was the history with some periods, and such poetry again became very much difficult for the readers, because it was the history, and history is the subject which is really a boring subject to the common man, and this historical matters cannot be the theme of the best poetry, but these poets adopted, or these poets brought the chronicle history which was lengthy. Remember, this history was lengthy, and common man has no time to see such lengthy things or such lengthy historical matters, and that's why this poetry was not read more by the common person. Those persons in those days were interested, they only uh, read these poems, and that's why these poems or this poetry did not get the proper group of readers, uh, and the chronicle history was the intellectual attempt of the poets. Really speaking, this was the intellectual attempt of the poets, but this was the intellectual attempt for the poets, but it was not the easy attempt for the readers, and that's why again I will say that this poetry became very much difficult to understand in the sense of the readers, common persons. And then these poets were describing the historical and social opinions with the concept of politics. Means they brought there the concept of the politics, they brought there the social opinions, and they brought there the historical opinions, and that's why these poems became rather boring, or these poems became rather ingenious. And again, the method of the poets was very lengthy process, because the historical matter is lengthy, and that's why here I will say the poetry of the 16th century was not the I will say the basic poetry, or I will say it was not the poetry of the nature, or it was not the poetry of the common man. It was the poetry of the intellectual man, and uh, I will say generally no man is intellectual. The person actually is a common person. The ratio of common people is uh, more, and that's why this thing was very much difficult for the poets of the 16th century. Then, after the allegories by House, the poetry came down. Then there was the period of the allegories of House, and after the period of these allegories of House, the poetry of the 16th century came down, means it was defeated up to some extent. The poets only imitated the medieval forms for writing poetry. Means these poets were only imitating the medieval forms. Means only there was the imitation of the medieval forms, but there was not the spontaneous overflow. Means these poets were not writing the poetry with the help of the spontaneous overflow. Means they were not writing the poems easily. Means there was not the I will say there was not the imagination which was essential in those days. These poets were not using their imagination, but they were using the medieval forms, the conceit, and that's why again I will say the poetry of the 16th century was very much difficult for the readers. There was no English poetry, though there was the classical poetry. Remember, this was the unluck of this 16th century, that there was the classical poetry. Means there was the classical poetry, means there was the poetry which was present for the classical people, means which was present for the I will say intellectual people, bright people or intelligent people, but there was no poetry for the common man. Means the 16th century poets did not do anything for the common man by writing the poetry. That is the thing, and that's why there was no English poetry. There was no English poetry because there were many problems we have seen in the first part and the second part of our lecture. That's why, as per Sir Thomas, Eliot, Ovid, and Marshall, these two poets were not the poets of the English trained. Means, according to this Sir Thomas, these poets did not bring the proper English trained, and there was no English poetry because they brought the trends from the other continents, I will say, but they did not bring the English trend, or they did not bring the particular or specific, or I will say particular trend of the imagination there. Wilson, the poet, was writing there to protect only the rhetorical poetry. See, again, there is the thing that there was the poet whose name was Wilson. This Wilson was writing only the poetry to protect, to defend the rhetorical poetry. Means he was protecting, he was defending the rhetorical poetry. Means rhetorical means he was giving support to the classical poetry. But this gentleman also was not giving the support to the common poetry or the support to the imaginative poetry like the poets of the 19th century. We can say S.T. Coleridge or William Wordsworth, John Keats. These poets brought the imaginative trend. Means they wrote their individual poems. They wrote their poems from their heart. Means they asked some questions to their heart, and their poems were really coming through their hearts or through their imagination, and that's why the poems of the 19th century were really very popular and message giving poems. But when we go to end this lecture on the 16th century, we can say that though this poetry was the classical poetry, or though this poetry was the philosophical poetry, or though this poetry was the intellectual poetry, or though this poetry was the poetry of the conceit, or though this poetry was drab and golden according to C.S. Lewis, I will say here that Shakespeare was the greatest poet in those days who wrote his sonnets, best sonnets, and he gave the poets the new trend of Shakespearean trend, we can call it. And then there was the poet Spenser, Edmund Spenser, who brought the Spenserian sonnet type. Then there was Petrarch, that Petrarch also brought his Petrarchan sonnets. And then there was Philip Sidney, and his Philip Sidney also brought his own style, and that's why we can say that the 16th century literature was philosophical, classical. It was not for the common man, though it was for the intellectual man. But this 16th century poetry has done too much for the society. Here today we have seen the part 3 on the description of the growth of the poetry in the 16th century. In the next period, we will come in front of each other by taking a new topic. Here I am Professor L.B. Gayakawad is taking your leave, but before taking the leave, I will request you all to like, share, comment and subscribe my YouTube channel. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much.